Hi, I'm Chris Murray from Autodesk Media and Entertainment, and in this webinar we're going to be taking a look at animation methods that go beyond keyframes into constraints, controllers, and wired parameters. In 3ds Max, animation really begins with the controllers. The controllers are, without a doubt, the most powerful aspect to animation in 3ds Max. You're probably all familiar with keyframe animation, where we move an object from one point to the other in 3D space by usually turning on the auto key button and then just grabbing our move and rotate or scale tool and moving it that way. But really, controllers are the behind-the-scenes action in 3ds Max and allow us to do a lot of more complicated types of animation. Now, we don't have enough time. We would need a whole day of courses to cover all of the controllers that are available in 3ds Max, but I'm going to show you how we created this simple animation in 3ds Max using a variety of the more commonly used controllers. And kind of explaining how they work and how to implement them. So if we could just kind of examine our finished scene here, we have a spaceship that's kind of flying through the surface of a planet, and we have a gun that's trying to take out the spaceship, and you can see that it's shooting and it's directing and it's pointing as the ship flies by, and those green boxes are dummy objects or helper objects. Points specifically. We also, if you notice here, we have a camera behind it as well. So if we switch over to the gun camera, we can see that there's some camera shake on there. We can see that the gun turret is following the object, and the actual muzzles themselves are recoiling with the shooting. And every time it shoots, the camera vibrates. We'll go ahead and press play it, so you can see we have some camera shake here. You can get a good look at that as it flies through. And we have those blue things on the end of the gun are going to be for muzzle flash textures. This is the end result of where we're going to go. Let's go ahead and jump back to an earlier version of this scene and show how we start to set up some of these animated aspects of this scene using the various controllers. So I want to start off in this scene just kind of explaining what it is that we're going to be doing. You can see I have the gun here. I don't actually have the ship in here yet, but that's okay. We just want to set up the gun, and you can see I have no animation or anything happening on it yet. We want to begin with the muzzle recoil here, and we're going to go ahead and use a couple different controllers to do that. Before we jump over and show you how to change out the controllers, this is our scene hierarchy. And you can see I have the turret base, I have, there's a cylinder underneath there, I have a point in place already, I have a camera behind it, and things are starting to take shape. This will change significantly as we move on through this section in terms of adding some additional dummy objects you saw in the beginning there. That's we had some more things there. So let's go ahead and start just by taking a look at the muzzle flashes. Now, to change a controller, let me actually start by kind of explaining what a controller is and where you can find it. If you right-click on any object and choose the Curve Editor, you'll be taken to the Curve Editor. When we see our scene hierarchy here, we're seeing some different pieces of information. Over here, we're just seeing objects and their linking relationships. Here, we're actually seeing what is happening underneath the hood in terms of the controller. The controller is the mathematical algorithm that calculates how the objects move through the scene. If I expand all of these tracks, you can see that the object, in this case the turret cylinder that just happens to be selected, the turret cylinder, which is also our gun muzzle, is made out of a cylinder, and it has a radius and a height and height segments, and these are things that you would probably realize or recognize from the Modify command panel. And you also have position, rotation, and scale. So you have two basic nodes. If we're looking at a hierarchy component here, you have the transform node part of the hierarchy, and you have the object node part. That's kind of important. Let's begin with transform, because normally when we associate animation, we associate an object moving through space. When you actually right-click on any one of these nodes or any one of these levels in the hierarchy, these are actually the controllers. Now the controller is, when we right-click and choose Assign Controller, this shows us all of the controllers that are available for that particular track within the curve editor. If I go in to look at my filters, I can choose controller types, and I'll turn that on and say OK. And this now shows me all of the controllers that are currently set for that particular track. So for example, in the transform track, I'm using a position, rotation, scale controller. And if we look at the sub track underneath that, here's the position track, and the position is using a position XYZ controller. And each X, Y, and Z position currently has a Bezier float controller on it. So if we select any one of these, we can see this is the controller that is controlling the motion for the Y position. So for example, if I right-click and I choose Assign Controller, notice that this list is much shorter than if I were to drill down into, say, the X position track and choose Assign Controller and get this list. We get a much different list of controllers. So 3ds Max is intelligent in that it will only show you the controller that's appropriate for that type of track that you currently have selected. It's not going to let you put a controller on there that is inappropriate for that type of motion. So it kind of helps you a little bit that you don't necessarily have to know specifically what each controller does in every single instance. Just know that if you're trying to control a specific aspect of an object, you know where to do it. So what we're going to do for our gun muzzle is I'm going to move this out of the way. We want our gun muzzle to slide back this way as we fire it. And you'll notice that's on the X-axis. So we're going to, actually, let me just double check that real quick. And let's do a local. Actually, it's the Z-axis because I'm moving this locally. I created my cylinder and then I rotated it. So it's actually on the Z-axis of the cylinder, not the world. So what I want to do is whenever we do a, for example, if we do keyframe animation on this, I'm going to move this off to the side again, and I'm going to do a hold so that I can come back to this. I'm going to turn on my auto key. We could conceivably go every couple of frames and then move it back, and then move it back up, and then copy these frames and do all of this, and so we get this kind of motion, and then we'll do this, and we'll do this again. Okay, it's a lot of keys, but it's pretty quick and easy. All right, and now we have all those keys in here, and if we look at our curve editor, we can see that this is a Bezier curve that we can use to control the animation. Across the bottom is time, and across the side here are the values of our motion in the Z-axis. So you can see it's pretty simple to do. Now you might think, okay, this is easy, why not just use this? Well, what if the length of the animation changes? What if the objects change within the scene? What if we want to do a number of different things that require the retiming of the animation? You're gonna have to come back in here and touch all of these keys. So let's take a look at a different type of controller to actually accomplish this. So I'm going to go back, and I'm going to turn off my animate or my auto key button, and I'm going to choose fetch to bring back my scene. I'm going to select this object, right click, and go into the curve editor again, and bring our curve editor back into the scene. And I'm going to adjust the position controller with a waveform float controller. This is a very automated controller. It is basically a series of sine waves. So you can see that there are no keys, but it actually puts the animation onto our timeline. I'm going to move things around here a little bit so we can see what's going on. And I'll move this a little bit up here. Now we can't actually see it. Actually, if I zoom out, there it is way out there. You'll notice it's kind of is moving way far away. We need to rein it in a little bit, and we do this by adjusting these settings. So we want to rein in the motion and have it be a little bit more appropriate. So I'm going to, you can see if we change the numbers here, it changes the animation curve on our timeline. And we're going to really just kind of set everything to 0 a little bit. I'm actually going to set this to 5 And the reason I set it to 0 and then set it to same numbers is to just get control of the curve so that I can see what's going on. And you can see, okay, we're getting actually pretty close here with what we've got, but you can see that its baseline is way off. If I just set the baseline to be greater than 0, which is what vertical bias is, it's still not quite enough of what we want. And so we want to actually use our manual bias. And what this allows us to do is this allows us to manually adjust what I consider the baseline of where the curve is. So the way I'm going to figure out where I need to be is I'm going to find the lowest point on our curve. I'm going to move that up. And I think it's probably around 10. And as I move out, I'm just kind of double checking here. Okay, that actually looks pretty good. It doesn't look like it moves far enough out here, so I'm going to adjust my amplitude up a little bit more to make it be right there. Now, this is also going to adjust the amplitude down, so you can see that it's coming back in. Again, we're just kind of, I'm looking at the bottom of the curve here, and I'm zooming in. Let me zoom in so we can get our numbers back here. I want the bottom of this curve to be roughly about 10. So I'm not looking at this number right now. I'm looking at the bottom of the curve here. Just getting it close enough for right now. And I'll move to the top of the curve. Okay, I can see I need to move my amplitude down a little bit more. And scrub this down to about 10. Okay, now we probably have something that's workable. Indeed, we do. So now that we have this moving in one muzzle, how do we get it moved over to the other? So I just want to copy this controller and put it on this muzzle over there. So what I want to do is I'm going to right click. I'm going to just choose copy. And I'm going to select this object over here. And I'm going to open up the curve editor for that object. Actually, I didn't even really need to do that because it's already open. You can see Bezier float is right there, and I'm just going to choose paste. Now, I do not want to paste an instance. You think you might want to paste an instance in case you change one, it'll automatically change the other. I actually don't want to do that because of right now, if we play this, you can see they're in unison. And I don't want them to be in unison. I want them to be alternating out of unison. And this is the other advantage of using a controller like Waveform, is that I can right-click and I can get the properties of the Waveform controller. And all I have to do is set the phase to 0.5. And now you'll notice if we take a close look here, you can see that they are indeed alternating evenly. And there is no variation in that. As long as I have these numbers the same on each one and I just offset the phase by 0.5, I can be rest assured that this procedural animation is going to work. So in this module, we're a little farther down the line. We have a rough version of our spaceship flying through the scene. You can see our gun turret is following along with it, and it's rotating around. You can also see that we have a lot more dummy objects that are in the scene as well. If I go ahead and select this and zoom in a little bit more, we can see that our gun is working correctly. I have the muzzle flashes on there, and I have some dummy objects that are doing some interesting things. So first thing I want to do, though, is just finish up with the muzzle flashes very quickly. I also used a waveform controller to control that. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't realize is if I go ahead and select this object here, which is which are the planes that are going to be with the muzzle flash texture, and I go into the curve editor for this object. I'll go ahead and bring the curve editor in here. You might want to, try to animate the material so that it's on and off only when it's firing, but I'm actually using another little trick. It is a waveform controller, which we've already looked at that in the last module, so I'm not going to cover that entirely here, but I am going to use a special type of track. So for example, if I go into our edit drop-down menu here, I'm going to add a visibility track to this object in and of itself. So I have a transform, which is its position, rotation, and scale, and I have objects, the object track here, which isn't really doing anything. We don't need to animate any of that. I want to animate its visibility within the scene, and we can see that by default, the Bezier float controller is the one that's on there. Now, normally, if you're using visibility, you probably have used a controller called on-off. And what this does is this allows us to create a on-off track, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the dope sheet to take a look at this. I'll open up plane 4. Here we have this blue line, and what we do is, historically, you would just add in keys wherever you want the object to be visible or hidden, and that's the way it normally worked. But that's not what we're going to do in this case. So I'm going to undo my assign controller, and I'm going to go back to the curve editor here, and we're going to use the waveform controller on visibility. That's something that people don't normally think of. Now, I'm going to go ahead and, just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to select this object. You notice we already have our waveform float on there, and you can see that I've already gone through all of the steps to make sure that it's only visible when it's firing. So, for example, I'm going to get a little bit closer here, and you can see when I move the time slider, and it fires, and it's visible. And then it disappears, and the gun recoils, and it fires again, and it's visible. So all I did to set that up was, I'll go into the properties of the controller. Again, I just adjusted the period and the duty cycle. In this case, the length at which the peaks happen, and the amplitude and and it's offset with the phase. And then once I had that set up for this particular muzzle, all I have to do is copy the controller, back out, come back over here, select this object, and we'll go ahead and paste the controller. Remember, we do not want to paste an instance. We want to do a specific copy. And then all we need to do, since it's very parametric, all we need to do is just offset the phase. We'll just set the phase to 0. And now this should be perfectly timed. Yep. So now our muzzle flashes are going to happen. All right, great. So enough of the waveform controller. Let's move on to other things. I want to talk about how the controllers that I'm using to get the turret to actually follow the ship. Now, I have a number of dummy objects in here, and that's because I want to limit the rotation of both the gun turrets, the gun barrels themselves, and the turret head. I only want the turret head to rotate in one axis, and I want to isolate the rotation of the gun barrels in another axis. And I'm using two different tricks to do this. The first trick is the rotation of the turret head itself. I'm using a look at controller for this object. So if I go ahead and quickly just create a teapot here and to show you what a look at controller does, if I just select this teapot and I go over to my animation drop-down menu and I choose a constraint. Now, ironically, we talked about constraints in another module. A constraint is a controller. So if I go choose the look at constraint and I choose to look at the spaceship, you'll notice that it looks at the spaceship along a specific axis wherever it's going. But since the turret is actually locked in one axis, I only want it to rotate in that axis. So what I've done here is I've set up a couple of different hierarchies here to isolate the rotations out as it moves up the chain. So here I have the turret base, and there's the dummy object that has the look at controller. So if I right click here and I open up the curve editor, we can see that the dummy object has a look at controller. It actually has a couple different controllers. It has what's called a rotation list, which a rotation list controller is a very helpful controller. It allows me to basically stack controllers on top of one another to have, almost like a blending mode of controllers that I can just keep adding controllers and adding controllers. Notice that there's a track here called available. And when you have a list controller, you can just keep stacking up controllers on top of one another. So we start off, this was a list controller. It starts off with a Bezier for position. We're working with rotation. Notice it says rotation list. We have an Euler controller here, and then I have a look at constraint. And so I have two controllers, and I have a look at constraint here. And the look at constraint, if we go over to the motion command panel, which is where we can edit these things, I'll go open this up and I'll look at my look at properties. I'll scroll down and you can see that I'm looking at the spaceship. Now I want to isolate this animation, isolate this as it moves forward. So as it moves down the hierarchy. I don't want to translate this forward dipping motion as the ship drops down into the cavern there. I only want it to rotate the turret head along the axis. I want to do something entirely differently for the barrels. So to do this, I have introduced another, I'm going to go ahead and close this up for right now. I introduced another dummy object in the hierarchy, and I'm under the link info. You can see that I am not inheriting the rotation from its parent object. I'm only inheriting the Z rotation, which is what allows it to only rotate in the Z and not the other axes. So that is how I am isolating that using a look-at controller. The look-at controller is very easy to set up, but this little trick helps you isolate that out. So if we look at our hierarchy here, you can see that this dummy object has the point controller on it, but it also has the turret box, and specifically this is the object that I'm looking for here. This object here is connected directly to dummy 2. Now I want to talk about the gun barrels, because it can get a little tricky if we try to further isolate the rotations once we get rotations stacked into one another. So I'm actually using a trick to do this, and this is a handy dandy little trick. Frankly, I came up with it for this class because I was working with this and I'm like, oh, there's got to be an easier way. And of course, with 3ds Max, there's a number of ways to skin a cat. So I'm actually using a camera as a dummy object. The camera built into it has two types. If you've worked with a camera, you know that there's a free camera and there's a target camera. The target camera is always looking at its camera object, or its camera target. So what I've done here is I've done a little trick. I'm going to go into wireframe mode so we can see it. Here's the camera right there. Notice what I've named it. I've named it fake camera. And all I'm doing, the camera itself is, if we look at our hierarchy, the camera is linked to this object right here, which is only rotating in the Z, right? Because we isolated the Z in our link info dialog box. It's only rotating in the Z. So I've linked it to that, and it's going to rotate in the Z. And then to the camera, notice that I've linked this point object, which controls the orientation for the gun barrels. Okay. Now, why use a camera object? Because simply put, the advantage to using a camera is that it gives me the ability to take advantage of its target. And all I have to do is, instead of using a look-at controller for these things, I'm actually using a hierarchy. So you can see here, I've selected the camera target, the fake camera target, and I've literally linked it to the spaceship. I'm not using a look-at. It's just a straight-up link, and I'm letting the automatic setup between the target camera do all of the isolation for me. So it's a little trick. So the rotation of the gun barrels is, if I double click this hierarchy, you can see here, actually I'll double click the camera as well. So there's the camera. The camera is linked to this dummy object and is controlling the rotation. All of the rotation is off of the point, and it's a nice little trick, very quick, and I don't have to worry about isolating all of this linked info there. So I'm not actually even rendering out the camera. I'm just using the camera and its target as a specific type of controller. Let's go ahead and move on to the next module. So in this last module, I just want to cover a couple of final finishing touches that give us our finished product here. And you can see I've got our gun bells going, I've got the muzzle flashes going, I have the rotations and look-ats, and using the fake camera to control the rotation of the gun barrels, and everything's working okay. I've introduced a new dummy object to work with this particular camera, kind of what I would call maybe a gun sight camera or a firing camera. You can see here our ship is starting to take a little bit better shape, and you can see what's going on there. So what I want to add here is the camera shake that we see here, and then I want to do one more thing with a different type of controller on an entirely separate camera. So I'm going to pop back out and arc rotate around here, take a look at our camera. So the reason I have if we take a look at this hierarchy here, I'll select the camera. You can see that I have a gun camera that is hierarchically linked to a point, and this point is parented to, of course, our dummy object here so that it is moving with it. Now, obviously, I only want it to rotate in Z as well. I want to, the reason it's linked to this, why not just link the camera directly to this dummy object, is because I want to introduce a new controller here to help me with the camera shake. If we go back and look at this, and if I go back to the beginning and I play it, you'll see the camera only shakes when the gun actually fires. And we want to time that, and it would be very difficult to time that with keyframes. The only way we can really do it is by using our list controller and a different a noise controller in there. So I'm going to pop back out, select our camera, right click, and go into our curve editor to take a look at how we have this all set up. So here's our curve editor. Here is our gun camera, and what I want to do is I'm using a position list. Now remember, in the previous module we talked about the list controller, and this is really one of the most flexible controllers that you have to use. Whenever you use a list controller, that should, honestly, that should always be like the first controller you put on there, because if you don't use extra controllers, that's fine. But sometimes when you create a controller and you do something special to it, it's difficult to add something on top of it. So if you start with a list controller, you can always add things to it. So you notice we have an available track. Whenever you use a list controller, you always get extra available tracks. So this, in my opinion, should be your default controller to put on here. But anyways, so we have a position list, which is just if we move the camera, and we have a noise position. Now, when I click noise, noise is very similar to our the waveform controller, with the exception of the waveform controller is very predictable. Sine wave type of movement. We just control the amplitude and the period and the duty cycle and the phase and things like that. Very predictable motion. This is generated by a noise controller or a noise algorithm that brings very random seed-based noise to this. And whenever we scrub it, if you see here, you'll notice that during the entire length of the animation, the noise is always on. Okay, the noise is always on. Well, then how on earth are we going to possibly isolate the noise just for a couple of frames when we want the gun turrets to fire? And this is where the list controller comes in and is really important. I'm just going to set this aside. I'm not going to close it. I'm going to go over to our motion command panel, and I'm going to find our position. So here's our position list. Okay, here's a position XYZ. Here's the noise controller. Now, you'll notice under here, there is a thing called weights. If I scroll down to our weights here, actually I need to set our position here, so we're in position mode. Okay, so I have our position XYZ and our noise position here. If you notice down here, it says weight. If I choose noise or XYZ position, we have a weight here. It's currently weighted at this particular instance. It's 100% position, and there's no animation there, so the camera will not move. And if I go to position, the noise position track, you notice it's weighted at 0. But as I scrub through it, notice it changes. See right there, the weight changes. So we're using a controller to animate the weight between position XYZ and noise position. Very tricky. Just a side note here, anytime you see a spinner like this with the up and down arrows, 99.9% of the time, anytime you see a spinner, this indicates that this is an animatable track that you can put a controller on. So let's go back to our track view, our curve editor here. And we'll go into our weights here, and lo and behold, there's our old friend, the waveform controller. And all I've done is, using a waveform float, I'm going to properties, you're very familiar with this by now, I've just visually lined up the timing of everything. Let me go ahead and kind of scoot this down here, and we'll go back to our camera view. And I'll go ahead and select the camera. So now all I've done is I've used our camera view to go ahead and just visually set up when I need it to recoil. And so it's recoiling, or excuse me, when I need the noise to happen, the noise happens every time it fires. And so I'm seeing when one fires, and whenever it fires, watch this gun barrel right here, and you can see the top of our waveform right there. Notice as soon as it fires, noise comes on. And now it's off at 0, no noise. Now we have noise. So I'm using a waveform controller to alternate back and forth between the weight in the weight track between the position XYZ controller, which has 0 animation on it, and the noise position controller, which is constant noise all the time. So when we do that, we get this effect of having a noise only when the gun fires. It's subtle, but it's going to add a lot of believable realism to our scene. The last controller that I want to use is a fun controller called a mocap controller. So if I zoom out and I look at my camera here, you can see what we want to do is use our mouse to actually be a motion capture device, and there's a special controller just for that. So as the spaceship moves through the scene, I want to be able to get a very handheld camera looking look and feel to my animation by controlling where the camera is looking. And to do that, we're going to put a motion capture controller on the target of the camera. So if I open up my curve editor to get access to my camera controller, we really want to change the position controller. So we're going to go ahead and assign a controller, and we're just going to choose a position list and say OK. And for that, we're going to go under available, and then we're going to assign another controller here, position motion capture. Now there's several mouse clicks that have to occur here. So let's go ahead and go through this slowly. So as soon as I say, as soon as I actually add the controller, you're going to see I get a couple of bindings. So let me move this out of the way. In each one of these bindings, we want to put our mouse control. So mouse input device here, mouse input device here, mouse input device here. Now you can see we have our bindings, our X, Y, and Z binding. They're set to horizontal, horizontal, horizontal. Obviously, we don't need them all to be horizontal. We know specifically the Z position we want to be vertical, so we'll go to the Z binding and we'll make it vertical. And we can just leave the other two the same. That's fine. We can even give them a specific track name if we want to, but we don't need to do that because the controller name will show up in our motion capture menu here in a second. So we're just going to set this aside. I'm going to go to my utilities command panel, and you'll see there's a button here called motion capture, and that is where I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way. I'm not going to close it. You can see the motion capture button here. This is where we actually control what's going on. So if I turn on motion capture, now you can see my controller appears here and it's ready to work. Now if I turn on the test button, this will test out the binding settings that I have here. So I'll turn on test, and as soon as I do that, I'm moving my mouse left and right, and you can see that up and down is correct, but left and right appear to be opposite. So I'm moving it left, but the camera is looking to the right. If I move the mouse to the right, the camera appears to look to the left. I like to actually have them switched. So what I'm going to do in the Y and the Z position binding, I'm going to flip the direction of axis. So now when I go back and click test, when I move my mouse to the left, the camera moves to the left, and when I move it to the right, it moves to the right. So that's the way I prefer it to be. One other thing about scale, frequently, depending on the scale in which your scene is working, you may actually get a lot of extreme movement. This helps you rein in the scale of the movement that is happening. So for example, in Z, if I set this to 0.5 and go back to test, this will really slow down the amount of movement that the mouse needs to occur there. If I crank this, if I take it really low, I'll go down to 0.01 and turn on test, you can see it's barely moving in the Z at all. So this is set to 1 for right now. That's good. This essentially controls the scale of the movement. So now, when I look through the camera, I'll go ahead and close this, and I'm going to turn off motion capture for just a second. Look through my camera. We'll go back to our motion capture here. If I turn on test, now you can see I'm looking through the camera and I'm moving around. And I can see I can test the range of my motion if I want to, just to see what I'm going to look at. And now we're ready to begin recording. So as soon as I click record, it's going to begin recording. So we'll start recording. And now I'm just holding my camera. And that was it. Notice it's still recording there. It automatically stops and it generates the keys. Now when I scrub my time slider, you can see the camera is actually moving. So this is a great way to introduce a handheld look and feel to your work with a motion capture controller. So there, my hands are completely off the keyboard and the mouse, and we can see that's exactly the type of animation that we're going to. In this section, we're going to take a look at the constraints method of animation in 3ds Max. Constraints is basically where you take one object and constrain it to the position of another object, or depending on the type of constraint, whether it's a path or whatever, you constrain it to the length of a spline and that sort of thing. And what it happens is as the animation occurs over time, whatever the constraint is automatically moves the object from point A to point B. Keys aren't necessarily generated except at the beginning and the end. So we're going to go ahead. I've created a little diorama here of a city, and we're going to use a number of constraints to do several different types of animation. If I scrub through here, you can see I've got some monorail cars going around our downtown center and stopping at a station. And I have a number of different cameras in the scene as well. If I hit my C key, I can see that we have, a train riding cam or a high orbit cam or a station camera, things like that. And these are things that we can actually use constraints to animate with. So I'm going to back out of my scene here a little bit, and we're going to start with the most simplest type of constraint, and that is the path constraint. So I have an extra car here, and what we want to do is we want to constrain it to the path of our other cars so that it appears to be going around the track just like everything else. So all we have to do to actually set up a constraint is go over to the animation drop-down menu, and here's the list of all of the constraints that are available to us. In this segment we'll probably be looking at the path constraint. I'll use another scene for a position constraint, and we'll go ahead and take a look at the look constraint as well. So all we need to do to constrain this train to the track position is go ahead, and I'm going to pop into wireframe mode here, and we're actually going to go ahead and find the train track, okay? And there it is right there, the rectangle train path. In fact, I'll go ahead and make it a different color so that it's very easy for us to see. See, there's our path that we want our train to follow. So I'll go ahead and select the train itself. And when we're ready to constrain it to a path, all we simply have to do is choose path constraint and move our mouse on top of any shape object and click, and it will automatically move the train to that path. Now it moves it to the first vertex. It's right there, train 4. Okay, and we can see that it goes to the first vertex position, and if I go back to my wireframe view, it's a little easier to see there. Now we can see that it is not actually following the path like that particular train, and in fact it's intersecting the other train, and this is by design because I want to show you how this actually operates. To control the parameters of a path constraint, we go to the motion command panel. And if you're familiar with the motion command panel, you know that you can actually see the list of all the controllers that are there. Down here under this rollout, we have the path parameters, and we can have more than one path control the position of an object at any time. In this case, we're just going to stick to one path. And we can control the percent along the path, and this is actually how we keyframe objects that are being controlled with a path controller. You'll notice here that this checkbox that says follow is unchecked. We're going to check that in a second, but first thing I want to do is I want to go back to frame 0. And I just want to go ahead, and you'll notice that this is where our keys are located. In order to offset the animation, all we have to do is, if you notice down here on the timeline, there's 2 keys. There's a beginning and an end key. And what this really does is just delineate where 0% is. So you notice it's at 0%, and as the time slider slides, it slides up to, at the end of the animation when it comes back around, is at 100%. So these are the actual keys that are being animated on our object. So all we really need to do is just offset these keys. Now I can offset one key, and that will have the same effect as offsetting the timing of the animation itself. You can see it doesn't even start moving until now. But of course that will mean that it will go faster than the rest of the trains on the track because it is occurring in less time as the rest of the trains. So we may not want to actually move the animation itself. We may just want to offset the entire animation, meaning both keys. So all I would do is just grab both keys and then just offset them a little bit, and you can see that it starts shortly after the other train leaves, and it will remain an equal distance behind it. Now obviously the animation won't actually start until this point, and we can adjust that later if we need to. But let's deal with the issue of getting this train to actually follow the path correctly. Now that we have the offset a little bit, all we have to do is just choose follow, and then we have to choose the axis along which we want it to follow. So right now it's perpendicular. We can just choose the y-axis. Now you'll notice the train actually has a front and a back. The front is slightly curved and the back is flat. This is going backwards, so all we have to do is choose flip. And now we can see that our train is following the path appropriately and is moving right along. So you can control the timing of the objects on the path simply by offsetting the keys, making them closer together or farther apart. You can even go in here and add them. So for example, let's say we want the train to stop at our station. So we'll fly around here. The second train comes in. It's going to stop very briefly. So what we'll do is just turn on auto key, and we'll just make this a round number. So it's 38.8. We'll just make it 39%. And then we'll slide this key over a little bit there to have it stop. So you notice, let me zoom back around. So you can see as our train comes into the station, it stops for a certain amount of time and then continues going. So just by adding keys directly within our percentage is a good way to control how objects start and stop on a path. Of course, the nice thing about using paths as animation sources is that we can actually change the path at any time. So I'll go in here and I'll go ahead and grab the path, and I'll just add an edit spline modifier to it. And all we need to do to change the shape of the path is just adjust the position of the vertices. So for example, if this portion of the track rises above, now obviously I don't have a track section here that rises, but in case we did, you could see that the trains will indeed, all they do is just follow the path and then go right down. So it's a nice way to control how you're actually controlling the position of objects based on their path. When it comes to cameras, cameras are also very effective objects to put on paths. So for example, you notice if I zoom out, I have a number of different circle objects, and you can see I actually have a camera that's on a constraint right now that's going around. It's very easy to set up cameras to do that. So with a targeted camera, remember, the camera is always going to look at its target. So I'll go ahead and grab the path constraint here, and we'll just attach it to this outer path there. And if I go look through this camera now, you can see that I'm actually looking at the target as the camera flies around the path. But let's say that I actually want to look at a specific train the entire time. So what I'll do is I can use a different type of constraint called a position constraint to control where the camera is looking. So I'll go ahead and select the camera target. So right now I have the camera target selected, and what I'll do is also under animation, I'll go to constraints, and in this time I'll choose position constraint, and I'm just going to position the camera to look at that train at all times. So now my camera is still orbiting the scene, But no matter where that train is, the camera target is staying on position, keeping that camera in the center of my frame. So in the event that I want to switch out to a different lens, I can go into a much longer lens. We can bring it in, and it will always be looking at that object. So it's a position constraint. I haven't done any keys. The only keys that are currently happening here are on the train, and the camera target is just looking at that in terms of how it's constrained to that object. The last thing I want to look at with constraints specifically is when you have more than one object, or when you're constraining an object to more than one object. This allows for some interesting effects. In this instance right here, we have what seems to be a pretty straightforward IK chain, but actually this is all just forward kinematics with a bunch of linking going on. The constraints are happening here with these pistons, and what I'm doing is I'm using a series of position constraints on one object. I have two different constraints on one object to give it the illusion that the piston is actually growing and animating without actually having to keyframe all of the individual positions for the piston. So what's going on here is I'm going to grab this bottom part of the piston, I'm going to move it out of the way, and we can see that that middle piston, the middle cylinder there, is the one that is being constrained. And what's happening is if I select this object and go to the motion command panel, I can see that I actually have two position targets. I have a point object, which is this object right here, and I also have the chamfered cylinder, which is the original object right here. And so what this means is that whenever I move this object, that middle cylinder is going to try to maintain its position equidistant between this cylinder and this object. Now the reason I know it's equidistant is because if I look at the weighting down here, the weighting says 50%. So how this is actually working is this node here, this dummy object here, is actually the center of the entire hierarchical chain that's in this scene of what's going on. This point object right here, if I kind of scrub out of the way and go to wireframe mode, we can see this point object is simply just linked to this object. So wherever this dummy object goes, the point object is going to go. And what this allows me to do is with this object slightly moving, it gives me a more realistic effect. If I were to actually have the target object be either the cylinder above it or even the dummy object, I might not get that type of effect. And in fact, I actually gain more control because I can adjust the realism of the cylinder movement by simply adjusting the position of the point object. So as the apparatus moves through the scene, I get a very realistic effect that the cylinder is actually sliding up and down in a hydraulic manner. This object right here, this cylinder, this is actually doing absolutely nothing other than just sitting there for visual aesthetics. That's not actually contributing anything to the position constraint. It's just part of the optical illusion. So by using this object and this pointer object that is hierarchically linked to this object, I'm achieving a pretty interesting effect using two different position constraints to kind of mimic a sliding IK joint. Parameter wiring is another method of animation in 3ds Max that allows us to control one object's position or some attribute of that object, some animatable attribute, by connecting it or wiring it to another object within the scene and using that as some sort of controller. So what I've got going on here is a simple claw type apparatus that's animated and is picking up a teapot and dropping it in another location. And the way we're doing that is with wired parameters for all of the various parts of the crane. Over here on the right side of the screen, we can see that we're using what are called slider objects or helpers to actually control that. And I'm going to go ahead and show you how we actually set that up and how easy it is to really control how an object can control another object within the scene through parameter wiring. Before we actually jump in and show you how to create a complex animated rig using a bunch of different wired parameters, let's just cover the basics of actually creating a wired relationship between two objects. So I have a couple of simple objects here, and I'm going to show you the process of how we actually create that relationship using wire parameters. So the process is basically selecting what object you want to wire to the other object, maybe determining which object is going to be in charge of the motion, so to speak. You can have a two-way connection, or you can have a one-way connection. And in this case, it's a pretty straightforward process. We begin by choosing right-click, and you can choose wire parameters from the quad menu, or alternatively, you can also choose it from the animation drop-down menu. There's wire parameters. It's the exact same dialog. But once you decide which way you're going to do it and you choose wire parameters, you're essentially presented with a series of questions that you need to answer. Do we want to wire the transformation of the object to another object, or do we want to wire the object properties itself to another object? So in this case, we'll do say object position. We'll do the Y position, and as soon as you make a decision on what it is that you want to wire, you're given a dotted line that you then connect to the other object, and you say, we want to control the position of the teapot based on the Z position of the box. And then as soon as we make that relationship, we're presented with the parameter wiring dialog box. And this looks like the hierarchy component of the curve editor or the dope sheet, and that's exactly what this is. It shows us the controllers that are being connected together. We say it's a two-way connection, and then we say connect. And so now as soon as we do that, you can see that our objects are now connected. And as I move my object, you can see that the relationship immediately begins to take shape. As I move the box up and down in Z, we can see that the teapot is moving in Y. Notice if I move the teapot in Y, nothing happens. But if I move the teapot, if I move the teapot in X, nothing happens. But if I move the teapot in Y, something happens. And if I combine them like this, even though it's moving in X, it's not getting a lot of motion, but even the slightest motion in Y makes it occur, that the teapot is moving in Y. But we can change this simply by adding a couple of simple mathematical expressions. For example, if I just want to say I want the box to move half as much as the teapot is moving, all I have to do is just do a simple Y position times 0.5, and we'll just update the connection. And now when I go back here, you can see that the teapot is moving a great deal, but the box is only moving a little bit. This type of setup, this is how we can begin to do some more interesting things with other objects as well. Just to show you one more thing that we can do here, I'm going to fetch back our teapot and box and bring them back. And let's do one more wire parameter just to be a little more interesting. We'll do wire parameter, and this time we're going to wire the radius of the teapot to the X or to the Z position of the box. And I'll bring it back here, and we'll make it a two-way connection, and we'll say connect, and I'll move it out of the way. And now when I go and actually get this, notice as the box moves up and down, the teapot radius changes. Doesn't change this way, and it doesn't change this way. It only changes this way. So we can begin to do some pretty interesting things when we wire things together. So I have our first part of our claw set up. You notice one of the boxes is blue. That's actually on purpose because I want to basically have some sort of point of reference as to what would be the first claw or the front of the claw, that sort of thing. If I go ahead and open up my outliner script, you'll also notice that our objects are all hierarchically linked together so that it represents a solid hierarchy. All right, let's go ahead and create a helper object. And so over on the create command panel under helpers, we're going to use a manipulator, and we're going to use a slider manipulator. And I'll just drop it anywhere in the scene. You can put them anywhere that you want. Even though they're objects within the scene, they're not actually in the viewport. They're kind of laying on top or overlaying on top of the viewport. So no matter which way your perspective is looking, the object will be there, so you can set them up to wherever you want them to be. This will be very handy with our layout tabs because we could set out an entirely separate screen of just manipulators and always call them back whenever we want to. But just to keep it simple right now, we're going to leave it at that. And you may have, if you're not used to wiring parameters or using manipulators, this button actually comes into play. This is the selected manipulate button, and that's how we actually slide our slider around to get things moving. So once we're ready to go, I'm going to go ahead and put a label on this, and I'll just say claws. All right. And it just has X, Y, and Z position. We can control the width depending on how much travel we want in the slider. This is just the X and Y position on screen. And then we have minimum value, a maximum value, and then a value button or a value field. This field actually determines the entire length of the value, and setting it now isn't really as important, and you'll see why in a second. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start just with one part of the claw, and I'm going to right click, and using the same method I showed you just a minute ago, we're going to control the Y rotation of this object, and we're going to use this slider's value to control the rotation. And as soon as I do that, the dialog box comes up, and I'm just going to say it's a one-to-one connection, and I'm just going to connect them. I'm going to slide this back off my screen for a second. Now, when I go into select and manipulate mode, I can now move the slider, and you can see that our claw is clearly, going way beyond what we would actually want it to do. We want to control how that works, and that's where these minimum and maximum values come in. So, for example, I can set the maximum value of our rotation to be, let's just keep it simple. Let's just say it's 1.0, all right? And then I can set the maximum value of rotation to be 1 as well. And now when I manipulate it, you can see that it doesn't actually go past the maximum value, all right? If I could put really any number in here. Let's say I put 90 in here, and I'm in manipulate mode. Notice it really goes crazy. So we wanna play with these a little bit and just understand how they actually work. Actually, I'm going to set that to 0. I'm going to go and set the maximum value to 1, and so now you can see that we've got that. I also have to actually set this back to 1, 0. Okay, so there we go. So now we've got that. Now that we have this set up for our value, setting up the other claw wiring is very simple. We'll just wire the parameters of this object's rotation to this helper slider value. Again, we'll do a double connection. We'll update it, and I can go ahead and close this. And now when I go back to, I'm still in manipulate mode. Now we can see that when I back up a little bit, it's indeed set up. So let me go ahead and just jump through these real quick, and I'm going to pause it for a second and set them up, and when I come back, we'll see what we have. Okay, so now I'm back, and I have completed the wiring of the claws, and you can see now that they're all moving in unison as I want them to be off of a single slider. And not only that, I've gone ahead and jumped a step ahead and also controlled the claw rotation. I've set up a wire for that using a slider manipulator as well. And you can see that's why I have that blue box as kind of the, I guess you'd call it the main claw or the front claw, so that I can always tell where it's at when I'm animating my objects. And so now at this point, I've gone back to my original scene where we started, and we can see now how all of the different sliders are working and what we've created. So very simply, I have created, here are my controllers, my sliders for the opening and closing of the crane. Let me go ahead and get into perspective mode, and we can get a little closer and take a look at that. So here's the opening and closing of the crane as that's happening. I'll back out, and you can see we're just now it's just straight keyframing. We have the crane rotation, and then we have the crane folding. Let me back out a little bit of that. So there's the crane folding and the crane extend. So the crane extends out, it unfolds, and it rotates. And that's pretty much how we've created this entire scene. Now, I've messed up all my animation a little bit. Let me go back and reload the scene. Okay, I've reloaded the scene here, and now we can see it in its entirety. And I used a little Mass Effects there at the end to make the teapot drop into place. So wired parameters is a great way to create a little bit more complex animation controls, especially if you're doing some maybe type of robotic work, or just you want kind of a mechanical look. You want to be able to have specific control over it. But for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward way to work. And when you're doing a lot of repetitive animation on similar objects, or multiple similar objects, wired parameters may be a method you may want to explore, because it gives you the ability to change those parameters in mass.